Is coming on. It's good to see everybody. Welcome to our time together this evening. We'll pray in just a second. Just go over a couple of the ground rules so that you'll remember that we try to be courteous and kind of one another with no judgment. This should be a safe place for us to share our ideas and opinions with each other. We want to listen. That's our goal, is to listen, but listen with the understanding that at some point we want to take action. We don't want to just talk about these things and then not do anything about it. And so to that end, I want to propose one thing. I want to remind you about the reflection forms, the post-session worksheets that are available on the website, and hopefully you're filling that out after each class. The idea is that you fill that out and you talk about, well, what didn't I know? What new learning did I have? And the idea is that at the end of this, we want to look at those in some way. Right now, this the last session of this study is scheduled for the first week of August. So that would be August the 5th, I guess, whatever the first Wednesday in August is. What I would like to do is have one more after that. And obviously, if you've planned not to be here, that's fine. But the one after that, the final one on the 12th of August, will just be for anybody who wants to come so that we can begin to discuss how we put this into action. We're from several different congregations, and we're going to have to do that in our congregations to decide what is God calling us to do in each of our congregations. But there's also a calling that God has on each of our individual lives, and it helps to process that with other people. So we'll come back together on that August the 12th, and that'll just be sort of a, what have you learned? What has this stirred up for you? What do you feel God moving you towards, pulling you towards in a way to that might turn into some sort of action on this. I know that's an important part. That's biblical. It's in the book of Acts, reflection and action. But I also know that my friends of color that I've talked with who and told them about this, they have all said the same thing. Well, we hope that this isn't just another instance of people getting together to talk about these issues and then going home and patting themselves on the back and not doing anything about them. So that's where we want to get ultimately. So if you have the opportunity to come back on August the 12th, there won't be a reading for that week. We'll ask you to look over your worksheets and maybe come back and we'll have some chances to share that kind of thing. Okay, let me pray and then I will introduce Jackie again. Gracious Heavenly Father, as the weeks go by, and we watch the numbers rise of the coronavirus, especially here in our own county. We acknowledge to you our concern over that and our anxiety over that and our fear over that. We acknowledge to you our anger over that as we look at people who don't seem to be taking those things seriously. And we acknowledge to you that some of us don't see what the big deal is, and we aren't sure why everybody else is concerned. We lift all of those emotions up to you, Lord, and especially as they are mixed at this time with protests and demonstrations and new ways of listening and hearing what our brothers and sisters of color have been saying for decades and decades and decades. We ask, Lord, that you would give us open eyes, open ears, open hearts, and open minds to hear how you would speak to us during this time. We make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, let me find Jackie. There she is. Jackie, welcome back. We are glad to have you. This will be the first of a two-part class on the history of racism. We are actually combining 4 weeks into 2, so there's a lot of work to do, a lot of heavy lifting. So let's get to it. Dr. Bragg has been with us before and is back with us for both this week and next week. Jackie, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to be with you again.
Hello.
There you go, well.
Hi,
Good.
Jackie.
Good. Today we're going to be talking about a history of racism in the United States. And hopefully when we are done with this lesson, you'll be able to remind yourself about some things you already know in terms of patterns and how they begin and how these patterns get entrenched. So generally, we'll be talking about colonialism and nation building, but specifically, we're going to focus on bias and citizenship. So let me start by reminding you that the definition we started out with was the interlocking advantage and privilege as well as disadvantage. And that's a systemic thing. Those are systems of advantage and disadvantage. And when you were with us last week, then Charles added that the definition can be extended to include prejudice plus power. And more specifically, racial prejudice plus the misuse of power. That's social power, economic power, and political power. And so I'm going to start tonight actually with Psalm 78. I'm going to read to you the first 8 verses, and this is from the New Revised Standard Version. And I want you to listen for, well, just listen. Here's Psalm 78, verses 1 through 8. Give ear, O my people, to my teaching. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings from old, things that we've heard and known, things that our ancestors have told us. Thank you. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell to the coming generations the glorious deeds of the Lord and his might and the wonders that he has done. He has established a decree in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach to their children, that next generation might know them, the children yet unborn, and rise up and tell them to their children, so that they should set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments, and that they should not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not steadfast, whose spirit was not faithful to God. And so today in this lesson, I will be inviting you to consider perspectives from different narratives. And what we know is that history is messy, because humans are messy and we are imperfect. But it is necessary that we consider a narrative maybe different from the one that we were taught as we try to go forward and look at these patterns in hopes of making things different. So here's the work for tonight. It is 2 lessons in one. So as you get into your groups, I'm going to ask you to do 2 main things and then 2 things under that. So for the first lesson, the focus is going to be on bias. And I'm going to ask you to talk about how you learned the facts you were taught about discovery of America. How you learned the facts that you were taught about the settlement in Jamestown. So those are your first conversations. Discovery of America, the settlement of Jamestown. And while you're thinking about that, consider the biases that might have been part of this teaching to you about discovery in America and about the settlement of Jamestown. So I would add as well, who were you learning with? I see that some of you are at least my age or older. So that's going to speak to who was in class with us, as well as who our teachers were. So that's your first assignment. The second thing we're going to talk about in terms will be citizenship. And I'll tell you this, and then I'll come back and remind you that for the citizenship piece, I want you to look at the Supreme Court cases that were a part of the second lesson. And I'm going to ask you to imagine that you're a part of 2 groups. And I want to know not what you're thinking, but how you might have felt or how you would feel if you were a part of the group that was considered 3/5 of a person. And so that you know some of the names that were people of color during that period, Phyllis Wheatley, W.E.B. Du Bois, some others that I'll share with you in just a minute. And then consider the other case that you might have read about, and imagine that you were either Tekoa Ozawana, the Japanese, or the person of Indian descent. And remember, they went to court to prove that they were white. So first thing we're going to do is that talk about how you were learning, and you're going to have a total of about 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk together. Any questions about that? You good with it? Good with it?
It's hard on Zoom. I've learned that silence is affirmation.
Okay. All right. Then let's go to groups. Let's talk about how we learned about discovering America in Jamestown.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm sending it out right now, everybody.
Okay, everybody's back. I can't wait to hear what you've said. So talk to us first about your learning about discovering America, and if anything you learned about Jamestown and the bias that was a part of the history you were taught. So let's hear from whoever is willing to volunteer first.
I will.
Okay.
Well, we discussed that the majority of us were in school in the 60s or earlier, and the majority of us were white too, and that we did not find that we were taught the full spectrum of what actually happened, that it was much more from the perspective of everything was, you know, Columbus was a hero, and the settlers tried to get along with the Indians, and, you know, the whole Thanksgiving thing, and everything was sort of glossed over.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else care to share from another group?
Well, we talked about, I think I was in college before I realized that probably the people who wrote the history books that the middle class white female teachers taught me from were probably also white upper class or middle class men or women who were, and it just came down the line. It was their perspective, you know, handed down in book form, and then it was the same perspective as most of my teachers, and then it was handed down to me in the classroom. So I think I was probably in college before I really thought about that very much.
Thanks. Is there another group?
Oh, I would comment that we talked about the Pilgrims, and most of us in this group were taught the Pilgrim story. Jamestown was not. One of the ladies in the group said that she didn't know about Jamestown until she actually went there. Mm-hmm. That story was not shown. And the other thing was the Columbus thing, that we forgot to notice that it was caused a great pandemic among the natives in the islands. There's so much missing history. Maybe we're getting out of that now. I don't know. Hope so.
Okay, so is it by any chance that anybody has seen what the kids are learning now, the books or the texts that they're using, or any materials that they are coming in contact with?
I haven't yet, but I have an upcoming kindergartner soon next year. So I'm curious now that you're saying that. I do know that I had a friend in a public school whose child around Thanksgiving did like the, it's really not funny. It's just like ridiculous that we still do it, but like where you wear the like paper bag and pretend to be an Indian and like the feathers, and then like the pilgrim outfit, you know, they like make the cute little outfits or whatever. And I remember doing that in the 90s, but I didn't realize that was like still a thing and was like okay to do, because like I always follow the motto like we know better, so we should do better. But yeah, but we talked about in my group too about like simple things like movies like Pocahontas that you know, it just, oh, they were in love and it just didn't work out. But like, look at the thing, you know, they brought the cultures together. It's like, it's really not what happened.
No.
So that was kind of the conversation my group had too, that it was also like not something up for debate or question. It was here, you know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, end of story. And if you had a question about maybe how the Indians felt about that, it was kind of pushed aside.
Well, Pocahontas went to England. She did marry an Englishman, so that was true. And she went to, I think she went and met with the Queen. So at one point, it was it was more complicated than it got later.
Oh yeah,
Right.
complexity is a weed through all of what we're talking about. Absolutely. But do you see how this pattern began? There were people in authority, people in power, whose job it was to teach us, to indoctrinate us, and they fed us and we swallowed it. And it wasn't until we were in a different context or a different age or stage that we even did anything different in terms of trying to find out information ourselves. So the question is, are you now seeing the bias that was a part of the history that you were taught?
Yes, but I have a question. So did they teach us out of bias, or did they teach us because they didn't know any better either? Like in the 50s and 60s, you know, was it intentional, or was it a lack of, or was it ignorance?
Well, I'm not going to say that I know specifically, except I see people perpetuating a pattern. It depends on who's teaching you how you take it in and pass it on. And when those people are your parents, your teachers, people in authority that you have no reason not to respect or believe, then you just believe it, especially if you are a child. And unless something interrupts what you've taught, either you come to be in relationship somehow with people who are different, whose perspective is different. It's like being vanilla and eating vanilla ice cream. You don't see anything different until some chocolate comes and interrupts. Do you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. There's no reason for you to think anything differently. And the same was us. For the people who are not in our group, I went to a segregated school until I was 9 years old, and we learned Columbus discovered America too. We did, and we didn't ask about the Native Americans. We didn't think anything about it. And we made the little bands with the Indian feathers, and we had the black and white things, just like we were there. Mm-hmm. We didn't even think that we were not at that table.
I grew up in a small town in Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Did I say it before? Oh. And it was kind of, I had schoolmates that were Indian, and it's kind of, they were less than. When I was in college, a friend, so-called friend, lined me up with this boy that she said had a little bit of Indian blood in him. I remember going to the door when he knocked, and all he needed was a headdress, and he would have just looked like an Indian chief. And I was so, all the prejudice that had been stuffed into me just came out, like, oh my God, what will my parents say? You know, like, it's bring home anything but an Indian. Yeah. And so it was a time when I was a young adult, and I was able to take it inside and say, oh my gosh, I'm not thinking right.
Thank you.
I love Native American. We all wanted to be like, I want to have Native American blood. I hope I'm part Native American. It was
That's the way I came up. The Indians were kind of heroes.
Not where I was.
It was never, I mean, they were not as well educated, or they didn't have some of the sophistication that the Europeans had, but they were really more capable. They could do things. They could fix things. They could make things work. And the Europeans have kind of needed the Indians, or they couldn't do anything.
But what about the cowboys and Indian movies?
Yes.
There were no hero cowboy or Indians that I remember.
Well, Tonto was pretty strong with the long.
Tonto, yes, that's an exception.
You know, this is speaking to that thing about history. In Fran's town, almost nobody ever heard the story of Chief Standing Bear. Chief Standing Bear was a Santee Sioux, which is the reservation right next to Fran, and he sued the American government and won his case, and he was the first Native American ever to be declared fully human. And they haven't heard about it in the town he came from.
Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, somebody needs to erect some kind of monument so that we are making progress in these days. But let's go forward and let's talk about the citizenship situation. I ask you to imagine if you were a person of color before 1870 and considered one of the 3/5 and how that might make you feel. Or if you imagined yourself the Japanese or the Indian gentleman from India who went to court to prove that they were white, that they might be U.S. citizens. So tell me what feelings thinking about those 3 groups of people invoke for you.
Well, I can speak to when you said to imagine. The first thing that came to my mind is I cannot possibly imagine, because I've never been there, and you know, I've grown up never even considering that. And I remember reading it in history books and saying, "Gee, what a shame!" But I couldn't relate to that whatsoever.
That is very fair. That is very honest, and I thank you for that response. Anybody else?
I had experiences in high school with not a huge number of African American classmates, but I did have some. And I remember one female who was very Caucasian looking. And I remember having just talks with her about passing for white, and that she could do that she could kind of be whichever she wanted to be. And at the time in high school, she thought that was pretty cool, that she could, you know, she could kind of move back and forth. And I would love to talk to her today and see how that that sense has affected her through the rest of her life. Because that at the time I was kind of envious of her that she could do that in some way. But I'm sure it's had both positive and negative effects in her life, I suspect. And I would love to have a conversation with her today.
So we didn't talk about apartheid, and so we have a few minutes left. So when you think about apartheid, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
South Africa.
Me too. Anybody else? So let's talk now about American apartheid, though. Can you imagine such a concept? In fact, we've been thinking and talking about just that very thing. And of course, apartheid is separation based on race, you know, only. And so there is American apartheid. What does that look like? What did it look like then? What does it look like now?
I just wanted to say that in reading all of this lesson, the number one thing that stood out to me is applying that term to America.
Okay.
And that was rather shocking and eye-opening.
Mm-hmm. Did you want to resist it? Like, no, that doesn't fit here?
No, I realized it did fit there. I went to the dictionary and it means separation. It means any kind of forced separation. So yeah, it applied.
I didn't think about it as forced separation. I felt it has been historically, from the white point of view, choosing to be separate, which is almost worse than.
A dictionary applied to both. I mean, but the first is applied to forced, like is in South Africa. And the second is just separation.
Okay, and so we can talk about the 50s now, and we could talk about Dred Scott. Do you remember the Dred Scott case? Do you remember anything about Dred Scott?
Escaped slave.
Okay, and so he sues the United States of America for him, his wife, and his 2 daughters to prove that they are citizens. And as such, since the Constitution is beginning now to say that if you're born in the United States, then you're a citizen, and that suggests that you have all the rights and privileges, and due process of law. And of course, he lost, which you might imagine at the time. But then not too long after that, some years, we get Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. Anybody know anything about that?
Well,
Yeah, that's the one I know more about.
I've been when I used to go to the beach, we'd go on the Thurgood Marshall Highway.
Okay.
Which was a narrow paved road. But I always assumed that that's where some of the schools were that Thurgood Marshall represented in that case, because some of the schools were in South Carolina.
Okay.
That kind of turned the corner on segregation.
Okay, so before we talk about the Brown versus Board of Education, let's go back and talk about Plessy versus Ferguson. This is where the Supreme Court declares that separate but equal is legal. You familiar with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I bring that up because I thought I heard a suggestion that the races were separate as a matter of choice. And was that true? Remember, we're looking at a pattern of racism here, and that pattern went back to Columbus and beyond.
Depends on who's doing the choosing.
Yeah.
Well, did the people of color, did the Native Americans, did the indentured servants who became slaves for life, did they have a choice? Did they
I didn't get to choose.
Okay.
No.
I would say the narrative was put to white people to make them feel more comfortable with what was happening. So I have a PR degree, right? So it's how you send the message of.
So in Tennessee, the message was sent by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was, you know who, right?
Founder of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's exactly right.
Bust is still in the Capitol.
It's so true. And I looked at it for 3 years on the building that was the student union at MTSU the whole time I was there as a sophomore, junior, and senior in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I mean, it was wall big outside on the student center, and nothing at all was said about it.
Right.
And so I go back to the question. We're looking at patterns. Do people who are not white really, did they, and do they have a choice?
Well, such a thing called redlining.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Was that a choice for
No,
people of color to live in these less than neighborhoods with fewer resources? Remember, we talked about environmental racism when we first came together, and have these dumps and this pollution and things in these neighborhoods. Is this a choice? Do people didn't have a choice?
Absolutely not.
And that's part of where we are today. That's why we can't shake this until we see the whole picture.
There's a legal choice and there's a practical choice. There's a legal choice that may exist, but then there's a personal choice that has to be part of that.
So talk to me more about the legal choice.
Well, the legal choice is you know, anybody can live where they want to. If they can afford to live there, they can, which is another issue that you deal with. But is there a choice that I want to live there? I think that applies both to blacks and whites. Do I want to live with blacks? Do I want to live with whites? And what does that mean? And am I comfortable with that? And we need to deal with all those issues as well.
And somebody that I was in a group with a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about this, and I don't remember, I hope that person is still on, was talking about making that very choice. I want to call up a realtor, and called up a realtor, and the realtor made the person understand that I'm not going to show you houses in East Knoxville because I decide that you don't need to see and live in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that was me. And we did have that experience. There were certain neighborhoods, because we were white and professional, you don't want to live there. I'm not going to show you that. And you know, we were just in shock that it was our first time buying a house. So maybe it had happened other places, but it was the first time we had experienced it. And we just were in total shock that a realtor would pick and choose who should go to what neighborhood.
Maggie, what's the time period of that?
That was in the early 70s here in Knoxville.
It's now. It's now. You know how it's now? Well, the house I'm living in, I've lived in it for 23 years, and I live out here at the base of the mountains. There is, until 3 years ago, I was the only person of color in this neighborhood. And so our neighbors across the street are a blended family. He's black and she's white. They've got 5 precious little girls. But until then, it was just me. But if you will just look in the newspaper on Sundays, when they are showing the awards that realtors have won and who's doing this, there's a whole page of realtors. How many people of color do you think are on that page?
None.
I don't think there are any.
Not many.
There are actually 2.
Two. All right.
There are actually 2.
Yeah.
But you know what, Jackie? Actually, it is against the law for a realtor to do that now. If you were looking for a house and
I was going to say,
you wanted to, you know, who lives in this neighborhood, a realtor would be breaking the law if they cannot give you that information. So that's, I know it happens,
But I think there's still a lot of subtle ways that people are geared toward a certain neighborhood where I think this would be perfect for you. And making assumptions about who you are, what your race is, what your class is, whatever. You know, this is where you would belong and be comfortable. And it's said as a positive, but it's really putting you in a box.
And there's also the issue of the best schools. You know, we're going to take you to the neighborhood where the best schools are. Well, that's coded language.
Yeah.
You know, and it's unfortunate, but that happens. You know, the whole thing of, I know we're about out of time, but the separate but equal. I kind of have a story to tell there. I worked for a school system in Southern West Virginia for 34 years. And the last 10 years, I was in an administrative position, and I was forced to go back through Board of Education minutes, you know, decades worth. And I wasn't looking for this, but in the process, I found where 2 board meetings were almost entirely committed to whether or not we should install indoor plumbing in that school down in such and such, which was a black school. This was 1948, you know, and how could someone say separate but equal? It was not equal. It was not equal in any way. And the board gets to decide. A board composed of white men and women get to decide who gets a toilet that's heated in a building. I mean, I was blown away because, well, I grew up in Hagerstown, Maryland, which was still south of the Mason-Dixon, but we were a little bit more progressive in that degree, but just blew my mind.
So I think this pattern is coming into focus for everybody. Would that be fair to say?
Yes.
That would be fair to say.
Okay, then we're going to be set to continue this study for next week. We're going to start with 1954. And even though this was a challenge, I think you met the challenge of centuries in an hour. And so now you got that under your belt. We're going to do the same thing next week. But seriously, continue to look around for the patterns. Some things have not changed. And just to add to what Vicki said, Vicki, if we were to take the realtor to court, so we're going to spend our money, we're going to hire a lawyer, we're going to take them to court. What's going to happen? What's going to happen when we take our realtor, either one of those two black chicks or the rest of them who are white, and we take them to court in Knoxville, Tennessee, or in Charlotte? What's going to happen?
Maybe 20 years later, something might happen.
Okay, all right. Let us start playing right now.
And it'll be he said, she said.
Yeah.
You know?
And the jury, well, let's not even go there. Let's just y'all
What does it take to attract more Black and minority folks to the realtor business? What obstacles are in place there?
I was going to add in a very slight moment. It's like, still, that's where even when Dr. King did some of his battles, it had to.
It's so true.
You know, but when we were looking for a house, we asked them for a neighborhood where there were some Democrats. So yeah, our block's almost Democratic. All the Joe Biden signs are up all the way down the block.
You're in good company.
You know what? I suspect if I were to put a Joe Biden sign in my yard, I would bet I'd give it 10 days before they would set my house on fire.
Right. Oh, wow.
Oh my God.
Oh,
wow.
But Jackie, can you hear me? Can I just say that I feel like we're leaving it in such a dismal place, you know, and maybe for that particular time period, yes. But today we do have more options. Had I been told, hey, I got to go to this one place and just look at homes, I'd look for me another realtor.
I know, right.
And so I think that, you know, yeah, we've come a long way. We've got a long way to go, but everybody has not been in that today, in that dismal, I just don't want to leave in that dismal, you know, African Americans, Indians, we're all just so poor and downhearted and have nothing, and it's not like that. Does that make sense?
It does. And
I had to say that.
I know, but you know what? This is an area of tension that we don't usually tread into. So let's see if we can live with it for 7 days and then come back and go from 1954 to the present. So
I was going to say that. I was like, it's okay for us white people to be uncomfortable.
It's okay for us.
It's okay.
You know, and Black as well.
I'm uncomfortable. It's okay because we know it's not. That's why we're here.
You're right. Okay.
It's okay for us to be uncomfortable. We need to be.
We're among friends, and we might get to be family, so we can live in this tension for 7 days. I'll see y'all next Wednesday night.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank
Everybody
you.
have a great night. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Appreciate everyone who is here, being here, and we hope that you come back next week.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.